Hey everyone, this is Mr. Moffin coming at you again with another APUSH video. This is our fourth video in the series focusing in on topic 6.13, politics of the Gilded Age. Now, last time we were talking about the Ben Harrison presidency and the beginning of Cleveland's second term as president, one that's going to be defined by the Depression of the 1890s. But really, today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be starting off talking about something that was already starting to be trending prior to Cleveland winning his second term. And its roots are found, going all the way back to the Grange movement and the Farmers Alliance that we've already talked about previously, going back to the 1870s into the 1880s. What we're talking about here is the beginning of the People's Party, aka the Populist movement. Now, the Populist Party is going to be I would argue, the most significant, the most powerful third party in American history. And so today we're going to talk about the origins of this political party and how it's going to start to have a major influence on what's going to happen in terms of the outcome of presidential elections and the transformation of one of the major political parties into a party that we much more recognize today. Okay? So, with that being said, we talked previously about how the Farmers Alliance movement was a much more politically active farmers union, if you want to call it that. The idea being is actively lobbying members of Congress, and in fact running some members of Congress to try to look out for the interests of farmers, particularly farmers out in the plains and out in the West. And note, once again, be mindful of why farmers felt they needed a much better, much more representative voice in government. These were folks that had, been the victims of, being overcharged by the railroad companies. These were folks that were struggling every day, as homesteaders. So these were folks that certainly needed help, or at least needed a government that was much more willing to listen to them. And so you start to see the Farmers Alliance that was made up of a northern version and then a southern version. And once again, kind of an amalgamation of the old Grange, farmers fraternity and folks that were supporters of the Greenback Party from the 1870s, starting to kind of mold into this thing called the Populists. Now, critics are going to describe the Populist Party as this, just kind of goofy patchwork that is doomed, to not be effective at all. It's kind of seen as a lot of these kooky extremist leftists from all walks of life kind of thrown together to try to, help the poor, but seemingly in a disorganized way. But the reality, though, is that they're going to actually become a real force to be reckoned with. And note, in 1892, we're going to be seeing the Populist Party actually nominate and run their first ever candidate for president, and that's him over here on the right, James Weaver. And James Weaver is going to, mark the beginning of the Populist Party being something of real significance. If you take a look at the platform of the party in 1892, you can see how this group is really, in some respects, really challenging the status quo of what we expect from government at this time. Remember, by 1892, America still has a very laissez-faire attitude in terms of what the role of the government should be vis-a-vis the daily lives of Americans. But take a look at this right here. Take a look at some of these things that are very progressive for the time, and even by modern standards might be considered pretty radical. For example, the idea of direct election of senators. This is going to be the first group that's going to be on the forefront of that. The idea being is that senators traditionally chosen by state legislatures was done in a very corrupt kind of a process. And basically corrupt state legislators choosing corrupt U.S. senators, that's not very good for the public at large. The idea of an 8-hour workday as, something that is going to be progressive for the time. The idea being that it should be limited. How about the use of a secret ballot in elections? Up to this point in time, when people went to go vote, it was actually a public thing. When you went down to the precinct to actually cast your ballot, you were typically asked, what ballot do you want? And when you do that, you are making a public assertion that you're going to support X candidate over Y candidate. And everybody would know that. And that could be used against you particularly. So, some of these things that these folks are, trying to address is going to be done in the future. They are on the vanguard of, things that are going to eventually become the 17th Amendment, the understanding of what the modern workday is, secret ballots for elections, all that kind of stuff. That starts with the populists. And if you take a look at some additional things, you can see stuff that is even, more radical, even radical by today's standards. The idea, for example, of having a single-term president and a single-term vice president, that's pretty radical. Now, back then, there were no term limits at all for president and vice president, though none had ever gone past 2 terms. But they just wanted a single-term president. That way, once again, you're going to have, a much more representative government that's not going to be, in the hands of few people for a long period of time. But take a look at some of this other stuff that's really radical. The idea being, the remonetization of silver. In other words, a silver-backed currency that would dramatically reduce the value of the U.S. currency, creating inflation. Now, once again, today, we tend to think of inflation as a bad thing, but in reality, first off, in general, a little bit of inflation is always what you want because inflation always helps debtors. And during a time where people are going to be struggling financially, you also want to have some degree of inflation because if you are a farmer, for example, that owes a mortgage to the bank for your farm, and you have inflation due to lower currency values, well, then you can charge a higher price for your crops, and therefore makes it easier to pay back your debts. Remember, if you owe, for example, $100,000, all you owe is $100,000 bills, whatever the value of those bills are. So if the value is less, it's easier to pay back those debts. Conversely, that's why banks always wanted to have a gold standard, because that holds the value of the currency at a higher level, and therefore the money that is paid back to them maintains its value. Anyhow, beyond that, this might be, if you look at number 4, probably the most radical of all of the ideas of the populists. Government ownership of the railroads, the telephone, and telegraph companies. Folks, that's socialism. That's just, there's no other way to describe it. And so you can see how leftist these folks are. They're talking about, institutions that are so pivotal to the livelihood of these farmers that you cannot allow these industries like the railroads, for example, to profit off of these farmers. That the railroads are supposed to be for public use. Telephones and telegraph are supposed to be for public use and therefore should not be based on a profit margin. But once again, that is very, very leftist stuff, even by today's standards. And once again, what's kind of amazing about all of this is that this is very liberal, lefty stuff coming not from, academia in urban areas, but coming from the poor working class in rural areas. Areas today that we would always associate with conservative values, especially economic conservative values. These folks are talking about very, very leftist, liberal economic programs. Now, it's not to the degree of communism, but still, by American standards, this is pretty leftist stuff. As you can see here, the idea of, having a government-owned industries to some extent are going to be important. And we've already shown you the results of the 1892 election previously, but we looked at it through the prism of Harrison versus Cleveland. And Cleveland, certainly, beating up on Harrison. But here's what I want you to take a look at this time around. Take a look at these green states out here. These are states that are going to be won by James Weaver, the populist. Now, note, it's only going to be about 9% of the total popular vote, only about 5% of the total electoral college vote, so certainly nowhere close to being competitive to winning the election, but in a close election, able to potentially chip away at either of the major parties. And, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about laying a foundation for even more political power in the future. This is not a one and done party. This is not, one great election, that's it. this is just the beginning. This is really just the beginning of the power and influence of the populists in the 1890s. Once again, one of the major issues is currency. The populists, we know, very much in favor of silverback currency, devalue it, whereas the major parties traditionally were both in favor of gold-backed currency, including the current president at the time, Grover Cleveland. Of course, this is now going to be happening in the midst of this horrible depression of the 1890s. And, why does this horrible depression start? Well, it starts off like pretty much any other depression. You see over-speculation in some part of the economy, over-investment. A lot of it was associated with over-investment in the railroads, just like we saw a generation earlier with the Panic of 1873, except it was even worse. We're going to be seeing in the course of months, thousands and thousands of businesses going under. The stock market in New York is going to be crashing. Bank failures happening across the country. Stuff that you're going to be seeing on an even bigger level in the 1930s with the Great Depression is happening now in the 1890s. You're going to be seeing at one point over 3 million people unemployed. You're going to be talking about an unemployment rate of 20%. This is just utterly devastating for the nation. And as I've said before, the nation is now starting to, for the first time in a very real way, starting to demand that the federal government step up and do something to actively help people. Back when the majority of Americans were farmers, there was more of a sense of self-reliance. But now, because of industrialization, we now have more and more people that are now basically, dependent on a local factory to try to put food on the table. And for these folks, they don't seem to have any kind of power over trying to, protect their jobs. And so the thought is the only institution that has the power to protect these jobs is the federal government. Now note, even though, I've kind of made it sound like farmers would not care about this, a lot of this is also farmer-driven, given the fact of how industrialization has affected farmers in terms of, access to, transporting their goods. So understanding, that there's this massive groundswell of demand to help the average American through the power of the federal government. And take a look at this political cartoon right here. You can get a very clear sense of the desperation and hopelessness that many millions of Americans had. The idea that the working class has now been shackled with debt and interest and has been crushed. That American prosperity has died, as you can see here, stabbed in the back with the Panic of 1873 and now assassinated, by the Depression of 1893, describing people including, Grover Cleveland as traitors that have kind of left them to rot in this situation. There is a real disconnect that we've never quite seen before amongst the poor working class and government. There really is a sense that government is in cahoots with the wealthy, the banks, the business owners, and they have, basically decided that they're going to let the working class die and not really seem to care at all. You can kind of see here through this right here, written by a farmer at the time, that kind of speaks to the significance of what's going on. He says here, when the banker says he's broke and the merchant's up in smoke, they forget that it's the farmer who feeds them all. It would put them to the test. If the farmer took a rest, then they'd know that it's the farmer who feeds them all. The idea being is that you don't have American society without a prosperous farming class. It's the farmer that provides the food that we consume at our table. And if the farmers are in a situation that is absolutely horrific and devastating, then the nation is going to be in a devastating spot. So if you want to get the economy going, if you want to get the nation out of depression, focus on the needs of the American farmer, okay? We'll leave it there for right now. As you can see here, we'll pick it up next time talking about Coxey's Army, and we will also get to one of the most important elections in American history, the election of 1896. We'll see you next time.